So in today's video, we're going to paint a very simple desert scene like this, and the painting technique here is very easy and definitely suitable for beginners. So to get the watercolor effect, I'm using a watercolor paper texture and the Alpine forest brush kit. And the first thing I need to do is use the fuzzy round brush from that kit, and then any kind of medium powdery sky blue tone, and I'm going to do the background wash. So this is basically the sky, and the horizon's going to be about here. So I want it to fade from a sky blue tone to a much warmer tone near the horizon. So the way I'm going to do that is I'll use the selection tool set to freehand, and I'm just going to circle the area near the horizon. Then I'm going to feather out that selection quite a bit, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'm just going to mess with the hue and the saturation and try to find a nice secondary color. There we go, that looks pretty good. I also think it needs to look more blue at the top. I'm realizing now that it turned out somewhat greenish. So again, I'll use the freehand selection tool and just select the top. I'll feather that one out. And again, I'll mess with the hue and saturation and try to make the color match a little bit better. There we go. And after all the main colors have been kind of laid down, I'm going to add some clouds. So I'm going to use the rugged mountain brush, set it to pure white, and just very lightly, I'm going to add some lines like this. Now to soften this all up, I'm going to use the water blender. So I recommend using the misty one down here at a pretty large size, and I'm just going to carefully tap around, break up some of these hard edges, and make this sky look interesting. Now I made sure to go around the edge a lot because I wanted to kind of stretch out the background wash and get as much space out of it as we can. And next, I'm going to move on and start working on the landscape in the distance. And this is so easy. I'm going to start with the distant mountains on its own layer. So I'll make a new layer above that background. I'll use a kind of bluish tone. It doesn't exactly matter the brightness because we can adjust that later. For the brush, I'm going to use the rugged mountain brush. And just along the horizon, I'm going to kind of do some random strokes with varying pressures like this. There we go, that looks pretty good. I'm going to change to the regular water blender, and kind of around 30 or 40%, I'm just going to blend the bottom of the mountains just to soften that bottom edge. So I think the mountains turned out just right in terms of their brightness, but if it didn't in your case, you can always adjust the opacity and control it that way. Now I do think it ended up being a little bit too high up, so I'm going to use the arrow tool and move it down just so it looks a little bit nicer against the horizon there. And after the distant mountains are done, I can move on and do the kind of rolling scrubland here in the middle ground. And for that, it needs to be again on its own layer. For the color, I'm just going to start with a kind of warm greenish brown tone. It's not super critical because we can adjust it. Now for the brush, I'll use the rugged mountain brush. And first, I'm just going to start very lightly, press harder, and then lightly again. There we go, and I'll do a few strokes like that. Now I'm noticing it's not standing off from the background. So to kind of respond to that, I'll just lighten it and try again. I want just a little bit of contrast there with the mountains. There we go, that looks a lot better. Then I'll slightly adjust the color again, maybe towards green, I think. A little bit darker. I know a darker version will stand off from this lighter color. So I'll do a few kind of rolling hills like that. There we go. Maybe I'll choose a darker one, a little bit more yellowish, and do a few more hills. And I'm just going to continue like this, making sure each set of hills is getting wider and also it stands off from the previous set of hills. So that turned out pretty good, but I do think I can make a kind of a good example of this because you can see the hills here, they don't get smaller as they go into the distance, so it's not totally convincing. Depending on your style, that might be okay, but if you want to make it look more kind of forced perspective, you can actually just use the arrow tool, and because this is on its own layer, you can just move it around. Then also you can use the distort tool here, grab the corners, and just pinch them in, and that's how you can kind of force a perspective, although you might have to move out quite a bit and really pull the corners to get the perspective that you want. Another thing you can do to kind of adjust this middle ground here is shift the hue. So it's on its own layer. So again, you can just use the hue, saturation, and brightness and actually just shift the hue, maybe desaturate it a little bit, and find a kind of color combination that suits your illustration a little bit better. So it looks to me like the sky and the distant mountains turned out a little bit too dark, but it's okay because they're still on their own layers. So first I'll lighten the sky a little bit. There we go. And then I'll lighten the mountains to match. I usually think it looks nice when distant things get more and more faded. So there we go, that looks pretty good. Then I'll just pinch and merge all three of those layers onto one. Now for the highlights, I guess it's optional, but I recommend giving it a try. And I'm gonna do that on its own layer first. So I'll just make a new layer above the background. I'm gonna use pure white to start. I'll use the Rugged Mountain brush again, a slightly smaller size than I did before. And basically, if I imagine, say, the light is coming from here, and these are all rolling hills, I'm just gonna kind of do a little bit of scratching just on that left side of each hill. And it doesn't have to be perfect. There's no kind of scientific process here. Just wherever it looks good, add a little bit of a highlight. So of course it's going to be too strong at first, but that's why we did it on its own layer. And I'm going to change the transparency mode to overlay. Then I'm going to lower the opacity to 0 and then slowly raise it back up just until those highlights are subtly visible, but not like super glaring. There we go, that looks pretty good. Then I'll merge those with the background again, just to keep everything a little bit organized. And next, just to finish up the background scene, I'm going to do a layer of kind of bushes and distant cactuses. And that's going to be on its own layer. And I'll just use any kind of desaturated medium green tone. I'll use the Forster Fine Liner at a small size. And I'm just going to go in the distance and do a bunch of tiny dotted line details like this. And then periodically I will change the color, maybe to a lighter or darker version, just so they don't all look the same. And I think one of the tricks with that process is to make sure the distant ones here are quite small and close together, and as they get closer to us, they get larger and further apart. And I think this scene looks good, but it seems a little bit sharp, so I'm going to blend it a little bit. So again, I'll use the Misty blender, maybe around 30% or so, and I'm going to very carefully just tap around. I just want to make it look kind of watery and stuff, but I don't want to make it just like a blur. So I'll try to be as careful as I can to keep some detail there. And I'm also going to use the same blender to kind of pull down the bottom here, just to fill in this gap. And there we go, just like that, the background scene is done. And this could be a finished illustration just by itself, but now I'm going to move on and show you how to add some large cactuses in the foreground. So the cactuses are really easy, but they do need to be on their own layer. So I'm going to make a new layer above the background. I'll choose a kind of cactus green tone like that, something not too saturated. For the brush, I'm going to use the fuzzy round brush. And maybe around 40 or 50%, I'm going to do some vertical cactuses like this. Now, I don't want to accidentally make a cactus where the perspective of it doesn't make sense. So in this case, that cactus looks a little bit too far in the distance. So I'll just kind of extend it down a little bit to make it closer to us. Same for this one over here. And then after that, I'll shrink the size of this brush just a little bit, and I'm going to do a bunch of cactus arms. And what's going to automatically happen is some of them ended up kind of pointed like this. So I'll use this as an example. Yeah, so they ended up pointed. Don't worry about that because I'll show you how to fix that later on. So as I mentioned, some of the cactuses had these kind of weird pointy arms. To fix that, I'm just going to use the eraser brush set to the Forster Fine Liner, and I'll just cut them back and round them over. So you might notice a slight transparent effect with the cactuses where the background is showing through. That's really easy to fix later on, so don't worry about it for now. Next, I'm just going to move on and add some details to each cactus. So for that, I'm going to need to make a new layer above the cactuses. Here's the green color we did them with. I'm going to select a slightly lighter and grayer version of it. For the brush, same brush, just a smaller size, maybe like 10% or so. And I'm going to go on each cactus and add some lines like this. Now in this case, it turned out really nice, but often it ends up being too light. So that's why I did those details on their own layer, because you could kind of lower the opacity if you needed it. But I think it looks good pretty high. And I'm just going to merge those down with the cactuses so everything's on that one layer. And after that, I'm going to tap on this layer and see this alpha lock option. I'm going to switch that on and I'm going to change to a blender brush here. I'm going to use the one at the bottom, the salty splatters. And at almost the largest size, I'm just going to randomly go over this. And at first, it won't look like much is happening. But if I zoom in here, you can see it's just breaking up the edges of those lines. And it has a really nice look. And I think the key thing with this blender brush is not to accidentally overdo it, because if you use it too much, those lines will completely disappear. So now the cactuses are almost done. Now's a great time to fix the transparency issue. So here you can see the background is slightly showing through the cactuses. So to fix that transparency issue, I have a trick I call the white background trick. I've explained it in other videos, but it's pretty simple and I can explain it again here. So here's the layer with all the cactuses. I'm going to make a duplicate of it, and I'll turn that off for now. Here's the original one that's still visible. I'll go to my adjustments, and I'm going to raise the brightness all the way to 100%, and it turns them into basically white cactuses. And this is functioning to kind of like mask off the background. So now here's the one with the color. If I switch it on, you can see it sits exactly on top of the white version of those cactuses, and that occludes the background, and we don't get the same transparent effect anymore. It's just important to remember to kind of merge those together, so the white version and the colored version are just on one layer. Now it looks good if each cactus has a slight color variation. So first I'm going to use the selection tool set to freehand, and I'm just going to select maybe these two, just like that. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll slightly darken them. Then I'll select maybe this one and the one at the end, and I'll lighten them just a little bit. There we go. Now it also looks good if each arm of the cactus is slightly different. So you should go through each cactus using the selection tool the same way and just isolate the arm and then make it darker or lighter, just depending on whatever you think looks good. So it doesn't seem realistic that the arms are only going on the left and right side. Some of the arms will be facing us. And it's a lot of work to paint that realistically, but there's a small trick we can do. So I'm going to use the selection tool again, and to add an arm facing us on this cactus, I'm actually just going to draw like this long oval shape, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just lighten it in this case to make it stand off. For a lighter cactus like this, it might make sense to do one and then darken it. And I'm going to go through and add in kind of a facing arm on each cactus. Now, I don't really want this cactus on the far edge to get cut off because I want to crop this illustration later on. So I'm going to use the selection tool set to freehand, and I'm just going to circle these cactuses. Then I can just move them over just with the arrow tool. There we go. And then I'll move the whole set over just to center it. There we go. That looks pretty good. And at this point, you can again play with a little bit of highlights and brightness. So this lighting looks pretty good because my background isn't like so bright. But if you wanted to, you could also make these cactuses kind of in silhouette by darkening them, and that will achieve kind of its own look. You could also brighten them if your background is dark, or shift the hue just to get a kind of different feeling. But I think it looks pretty good like this. There we go. And once I'm happy with that, I'll just merge them together with the background. And once everything is once again on one layer, you can see where these cactuses are sort of meeting with the dirt here, or the ground. I recommend using the Misty Water Blender again, maybe around 30%, and just carefully tapping that area to soften it up. You might also go around the cactuses in general and add a bit of softness. So at this point, the illustration is basically done, and all we have to do is cut it into a rectangular shape that would fit in a frame. And I want to show you a really interesting way to do that. So this will only work if everything is on one layer like this. And I'm going to use the eraser brush, and I'm going to set that to the Forster Fine Liner, and maybe around 10%. I'm just going to go around, and I'll use this as an example. So I'm going to square off this edge and just do a long press so it kind of straightens out. Now along the edge of the cactus, I'm actually going to follow it, and then again down here, I'll just continue with that sharp edge, and I'm going to crop it that way. and leave the cactuses kind of sticking out on the sides and the bottom. And after I've erased that line, I'm left with a lot of extra watercolor along the edges, and you could erase that by hand, but it's really easy to use the selection tool to get rid of it. So I'm going to grab the selection tool and set it to automatic, and I'm going to click and drag here on the body of the illustration, and as I slide it around, it's going to set the threshold. I'm going to try to set it so it fills out only the area that I selected, but not like too far like that. So I think about like that looks pretty good. Then down here where it says invert, I'm going to tap on that. That just flips around the selection and selects everything that we hadn't selected before. Then I can just open the layers panel, tap on our layer, and click clear. And there you can see it just kind of removes all that excess stuff and saves you a lot of time. The end result might be a little bit wonky like this, so go ahead and use the arrow tool set to distort or warp, and you can straighten it out if you need to. And there we go, this simple desert scene is all done, and here's the final result. And that pretty much wraps it up. As always, if you think I've earned it, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks again for all your support, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.